During the first week of classes, you don't have any assignments that are due, but I do like to go over the basic introductory terms so that we can all get on the same page with some basic terminology. It just makes it a little bit easier for you to understand the textbook and get going right away in week 2. I'll also say that the introduction is tested in quiz number 1. Many of these terms will crop up during that first quiz. So first what I'm going to do is I'm going to pronounce each one of these terms for you, and then I'm going to give you a description of what each one of these terms actually means. So your first term is aural: notes, pitch, harmonic, melodic, interval, chords, notation, dictation, transcribe, and scales. So these are all terms that you absolutely need to know to do well in this course. If you don't know these basic terms, you're going to find the textbook a little bit hard to read, and you're probably not going to do so well in that first quiz. So the first term, aural. It's not oral. Aural has to do with the ear. Oral has to do with the mouth. So aural is perception of any musical event that the ear can translate and understand. So here are a few examples of the word in a sentence. The music provided an aural experience unlike anything you've ever heard. What did you enjoy about the aural aspects of the presentation? I really need to work on my aural musicianship skills so the professor doesn't think I'm just phoning it in on those ear training drills. Let's find a quieter coffee shop. The aural stimulus of this crowd makes it hard for me to hear you. I'm sure that's one you guys are going to use all the time. That movie was an aural feast of sonic goodness. So the term aural can be used to describe anything that you hear. In the context of musical training, it's usually used to describe the development of the ear. That's why the subtitle for this course is aural training. It's a simpler way of saying ear training, because you're not really training the ear, you're training the brain to understand the difference between various musical sounds. Okay, your next term is note. This is a visual or written representation of sound. Now the term note is often used incorrectly. Sometimes when people say note, they really mean pitch, which is the next term we're going to talk about. But a note doesn't actually make a sound until somebody acts upon it and plays it on their instrument. A pitch does make a sound. So I'm kind of introducing the term note and pitch at the same time right now because they're sort of two sides of the same coin. But you need to know that a note in a very technical manner means the visual or written representation of sound. It's just what you see on a piece of sheet music. So here are a few examples of it in a sentence. If I don't learn to identify notes on the staff, I'm never going to pass this class. That's absolutely true. Unit 1, if you don't learn to identify those notes, you're going to be in really big trouble. You need to take the time to learn to identify the notes in the treble and the bass clef. I'm just warning you about that now. I wonder if there's a way to identify notes based on how high or low they fall on the staff. Maybe a simple numerical value attached to the note name would work. So this is actually sort of a preview of something you're going to learn about called octave registers. So in addition to note names, we can also identify a note with a number, and that tells us how high or low the note is. So a note with a lower number is going to be a lower note. A note with a higher number is going to sound higher. In the visually and aurally stunning masterpiece, there's that word aurally in, Amadeus, Emperor Joseph II told Mozart there were simply too many notes. I wonder if that actually happened. The piece is fine to listen to, but I really want to get a score so I can see all of the notes. My dear friend, what you see on that score are mere notes. The music comes only when you play the notes with passion and spirit. So notes are usually round, and many of them come with stems attached. Stems are just short lines that are drawn off the side of a note. And the stems actually identify the note in a very specific way. It identifies potential note values, how long they're held for. But we'll get to that a little bit later. So notes are used to make it possible to reproduce with accuracy something that is heard by the ear. So that something that is heard by the ear could be pitch. which is the next term we're going to talk about. So pitch is the aural representation of a specific sound. It's a specific sound that can be written using musical notes. Sometimes the term pitch is used generically to refer to how high or low a note sounds when it's played. Now, there are some instruments that don't produce pitch. Percussion instruments produce what we call indefinite pitch. You can't really nail down the exact note that's being played from a drum. It has sort of a range of notes, and you can tune drums to a certain extent, but a true drum isn't going to have a specific pitch that I could then go play on the piano. It's more of a spectrum of noise. Can you please tell me what pitch I'm hearing? Night wind. Do you hear what I hear? Little lamb. No, notate the pitches for Murray and we'll talk. Composer. Write down the pitches I sing. Assistant. Yes, of course. I will turn those pitches into notes. The pitch is just a little bit high, which is making you sound out of tune. Can you bring it down a bit? That's probably the most practical application of the term pitch. Often if you're playing it in an ensemble, you want to play in tune with everybody else. When you're not playing the same pitch, or when you're playing the same pitch but it's just slightly off, what you'll hear is a beating sound between you and another person who are attempting to play the same pitch. When you and another player both play the same exact pitch, you create greater resonance and the note is able to travel further. So being able to play a pitch in tune is actually really important, and that's part of what ear training helps you develop, the ability to hear when you're playing something in tune with another person or out of tune. So don't confuse the term pitch with note. A pitch is what you hear. A note is just a written representation of a pitch. Musicians often use the terms interchangeably, but it's best to use the right term as much as possible. Generally, you can tell from context whether somebody's talking about a pitch or a note, but it's best to use the proper term whenever you can. Harmonic. Most of you probably know what harmony is. It refers to two or more sounds heard at the same time with a note stacked in a vertical manner in the score. So, stacked in a vertical manner in the score, that just means that they're going to be played at the same time. Harmonic can also be thought of as a formation of sound that is produced by playing two or more notes at once. So, harmony could just consist of two notes that are played at the same time. So you have an interval of maybe a fifth, which describes how far apart the two notes are. A fifth would be a note that is 5 notes away from another pitch, 5 consecutive notes. Again, a topic we're going to get into when we talk more about intervals. But for now, just know that harmony has to deal with the background of the music. Harmonically, that piece was really dense with lots of rich colors. I love the harmonic texture of that piece. It's really light and airy. So these are some of the ways you can actually describe harmony. You can describe it as being really dense. You can describe it as being very dissonant. You can describe it as having a lot of different colors. There are many ways to describe harmony. However, we are going to try and teach you in this course how to use specific terms like major, minor, augmented, and diminished to talk very specifically about harmony. So you can talk to your friends about music if they have the same vocabulary in a much more precise manner. In 1951, the composer Arnold Schoenberg's last word was harmony. That's interesting since a lot of people think his music didn't have much in the way of traditional harmony. Arnold Schoenberg is one of those people, really the person responsible for the creation of things like the 12-tone system or atonal music. A lot of you may have heard atonal music and not realized it. It often occurs as a background track to horror movies and other types of movies and film. But one of the things he wasn't really known for was having a very strong harmony in his music. He had harmony, but it didn't fit our traditional definition of what harmony was. he really opened up music to allow a lot more sounds. If it wasn't for him, we probably wouldn't be able to appreciate rock music and some other types of music that use some really clashing chords. The harmonic parts of the orchestra were too loud. The conductor should have isolated the harmonic pitches and made them quieter. It's one of the roles of a conductor. They're supposed to balance the orchestra. So this is one way to talk about what you didn't like about a performance. Maybe the melody didn't come through and you couldn't hear it because the harmony was playing way too loud. So this is an example of how you might use the term harmony to talk about whether or not you liked a piece in a performance. So harmonic relates to the background parts in a musical work. Harmony can occur when two or more notes are written to be played at the same time. When harmony is used in a musical work, it is generally intended to support a melody and add color to a piece. There's that word color again. When we talk about harmony and chords and intervals, we'll often describe them in terms of color. You can have dark harmonies, which are generally more dissonant sounding, or you can have really light harmonies, which are generally more happy sounding. So harmony can be used to indicate the arrival of important motives and support programmatic elements in a work. Melodies can be derived from the notes present in a harmony as well. So what that means is if you have a piece that starts out with a chord, maybe it's a unique chord, maybe it's a standard chord, and then the melody takes those notes in the chord, in the harmony, that were all played at the same time, and it plays them one at a time from the bottom to the top as one possible example. That's one way you can use harmony to sort of create a melody that develops out of this germ of an idea in the harmony. It's something we'll talk about later as well. So now the other side of harmonic is melodic. So this is a melody. These are the notes that are played consecutively in a linear and horizontal manner rather than being played vertically or simultaneously. That's another way of saying these are the melodic aspects of a piece that you can sing. You can't really sing a harmony unless you have the ability to sing multiphonics, but you can sing a melody because the notes occur one at a time. Most melodies. We're talking about traditional common era melodies here. Classical period, romantic period. So the melodic contour of that melody was like a mountain range with one apex and several smaller peaks along the way. I didn't care much for the melody, but the harmony was incredible. Again, another way of contrasting two different elements of a piece and saying, you know, I didn't like that melody, but the harmony was fine. So maybe the composer needs to go back to the drawing board and write a piece that I actually like. Something like that. Some of the pitches that I heard in the melody were a little strange. I'd like to see the score to look at the actual notes. So this is an example of somebody who listens to a performance and they're not sure that it was performed correctly. So assuming that this person has the ability to read music, then they can look at a score to determine whether or not the performer actually played the melody correctly. Here's a more advanced usage. A tone color melody, also known as Klangfarben melody, combines the melodic and harmonic aspects of a piece into a succession of aural wonders. So this is something that Arnold Schoenberg did. He took what could be considered harmony and he basically created clusters of varying levels of dissonant sounding chords. So two or more notes that were, a chord is actually three or more notes, but intervals and chords, so it would be two or more notes of chords that would be played at the same time, and he'd do it in a way where they ended up creating their own sort of 3D melody. So you won't be able to sing Klangfarben melody because there'd be too many notes involved in the actual melodic melody. The term melodic can refer to any melody that uses a sequence of notes that rise and fall. The conventional usage of the term melodic would discount any notes that aren't part of the melody. However, some 20th century composers tried to expand the concept of what a listener may consider as a melody. Melodies are used in a variety of ways to develop a musical work. Some composers may even attach melodies to particular characters or concepts in a programmatic work. Now that last sentence is actually really common in music. What happens in especially a lot of operas is each character will have their own melody. the villain might have a very ominous sounding melody that doesn't have a whole lot of notes to it. Maybe it's very simple. Maybe it's a very powerful melody. Maybe a king would have a very royal sounding melody. And the composer can then intertwine these different melodies in the background to add an extra layer to what is being said on the stage. So that's one way that melodies can be used to create drama in a piece. The next concept is actually a very important concept. The concept of the interval is something that allows you to create chords, construct major and minor scales, determine the various church modes. The interval is actually what allows different scales and different pieces to sound unique. So it's a very important concept that you must understand. This is the very last thing we actually teach in the course, but throughout the 5 units, as you progress through this course, you'll be learning about the interval in segments. So I'm going to try and introduce this to you early on so that when it comes time for you to actually start calculating intervals, you understand the concept, which should make it easier for you to be able to identify all the 12 simple intervals that we have in our musical system. So an interval, very simply, is the distance between 2 pitches or notes. An interval can be played harmonically or melodically. Now, pay attention to that note about pitches or notes. An interval can be heard or it can be seen on a piece of sheet music. There are actually 2 different types of intervals that way. So here are a few examples of how you might use the word interval in a sentence. Listen to the harmonic intervals in this piece and you'll see that the melody also uses the same intervals. This goes back to the concept I was talking about earlier, where you could have a harmony that provides essentially the seeds for the melody in a composition. So the melody can actually come out of the harmony. Another example is, if you ever wondered how composers construct music, they often build from harmonic intervals that later become important parts of the composition. The composer keeps using this interval throughout the music. It's strange and seems out of place. Let's find all of the instances of this interval and see if we can discover a reason for the composer's inclusion of the interval in the work. That's something that you might want to do when you're analyzing a work. If you're a composer or you're just interested in learning what the composer of the work was trying to accomplish, often they'll use these sort of clues that provide insight into what they were thinking in the composing process. A simple interval that's repeated throughout the entire composition might be an important element of the structure of the work. And so by learning to identify intervals, you can get into the mind of the composer and you can more readily see when a particular interval in the piece is used for a compositional device to make the music more interesting, or to create what you might want to consider as familiar characters in a piece. This interval serves as a motive in this highly programmatic piece and serves as a sign that the main character is troubled. If you hear it while watching the movie, you'll know that the main character is dealing with cognitive dissonance about an unresolved issue. So this expands a little bit upon the previous point, the previous sentence, where a particular interval, a very small element in a musical work, can become such an important aspect of the work. 2 little notes, when repeated in a very characteristic way, could start to identify individual characters, their mood, and it can provide additional information on how the movie is developing. So if you hear a particular dissonant interval that has a very clashing kind of angsty sound, and it only appears when a certain character is present on the screen, then you know that that character is dealing with some sort of issue. It creates suspense and a sort of unresolved angst in the work. An interval is one of the most basic harmonic elements in a musical work. Intervals can be used in all kinds of ways to make it possible for you to better understand characters in a play, follow the storyline of an opera in a foreign language, and analyze a musical work. So the interval is possibly one of the most important elements in a musical work, and it's very important that anytime you hear the term interval pop up in this course, you will pay attention to that so that when it comes time for you to calculate intervals in Unit 5, you already know what the concept of an interval is. Notation. This is a visual representation of a musical performance. Notation is essentially a system used to represent in a written form the pitches that you hear and how they are performed in a musical work. So here are a few examples. The notation for this score is very sloppy. That can mean anything. That could mean that the notes are spaced too closely together. Maybe the composer doesn't provide enough information for the performer to do a good job in a performance. A sloppy score can be very hard to read and frustrating for the performers. It can end up taking more rehearsal time, and it can cause a lot of problems when you're getting paid as a professional musician to learn a piece quickly and then perform it for the public. I love that song so much. I went home and notated the melody. So this is kind of a stretch on how you might use word notation, but the basic concept is that this person, they loved the song and they went home and through their own mental recall of the melody, they were able to create notation for the melody. So here's a question. Would you notate this piece for me so that I can play it on my didgeridoo? Answer, of course. I would love to turn that song into musical notation. That's probably a more accurate way of using the word notation. And if you don't know what a didgeridoo is, you should definitely go look that up. It's a very interesting instrument, and I think you'll actually have a lot of fun looking at YouTube videos or wherever you may find it, learning about that instrument. I don't see the melody notated in the score. This is probably the most practical application of the word notate. If you're a performer or a conductor and you're looking at a score with 5 to 30 parts on it, and you don't see the melody in the score, then this is a good way to ask somebody for help. Figure out where the melody actually is. Maybe it's an obscure or abstract piece where the melody isn't easily identifiable. As a conductor or performer, you should always be aware of where the melody is. So knowing how to read a score, to analyze a piece and figure out where the melody is, mostly in more advanced scores of the 20th century and 21st century, is an important part of being a musician. Notation is essentially the formatting and structure that is used for written music. A musical score uses notation to tell the performer how to interpret the music. Symbols can be used in a score to indicate how loud a particular section should be, when to speed up or slow down, or even when to breathe. Pretty much anything that can be performed can be notated in some manner. Now we're going to talk about chords. This is another important term that you really need to understand from the outset so that I don't have to keep saying a combination of 3 or more sounds. That's not really what a chord is in the most specific sense when we refer to Western music. And when we refer to Western music in this course, we're mostly talking about the Common Era, the classical period, about 1750 to 1820, part of the Romantic period, and some of the periods that came right before the classical period. So we're talking about a period of about maybe 400 years total where a concept known as tonal harmony was used. So chords are any combination of 3 or more notes or pitches that may be written or played melodically. When they're melodically played, they're broken up, so you hear one pitch after another, like dun dun dun. Or harmonically, I can't sing a harmonic chord, so you're just going to have to take my word for it that those 3 notes I played would be performed at the same time if they were to be harmonic. So here's a few examples in a sentence. These chords were really unique. Play them melodically so that I can hear each individual note. This composer really likes using these chords. I notice that the same chords come back at the beginning of each section. I keep trying to find the right chord to complement this melody, but I'm having a hard time figuring out one that sounds right. Can you notate this chord so that I can see the notes? I can sing you the pitches in a melodic fashion, but I don't know the interval between each note of the chord. So here is an important concept. Whereas an interval is the distance between two notes, a chord contains 3 or more pitches. And generally those pitches are going to be separated by a very specific interval known as a third. So each note is separated by another note to give you a very harmonious sound. If you go to the piano and you play the notes C, D, and E, or you play 3 white keys that are right next to each other, it's going to clash. If you instead skip one note on the piano, so instead of playing 3 consecutive white keys, you play one white key, skip the next, play the next white key, skip the next, and then play the next white key, then you're going to hear what a chord sounds like. So chords can be somewhat of a difficult concept to grasp. Throughout the course, your understanding of what constitutes a chord will improve. Chords must contain at least 3 notes, but depending on the time period of the music, there are different types of chords that composers have used in the creation of their works. A chord could have 3 notes, 4, 5, 6, or even 7 notes. There isn't really a limit to how many notes a chord could have, and that creates a lot of variety for composers. Next, we're going to talk about dictation. This is a process of notating a musical work. So, dictation requires a well-developed ear so that you can accurately turn a performance into written notation. So whereas notation is a final product, notation is what you have in front of you, the printed sheet music, the notes, the time signatures, everything that goes into a written score. Dictation is a process of creating that notation. Think of it as writing. If you're sitting down to write a book, as you're typing out the words, maybe from a lecture that you're listening to, the words are the dictation from the lecture. The notation would be the final written product. I need you to dictate this melody for me. I'm just not able to find the right notes for the pitches I'm hearing. The detective was hard at work dictating the ancient melody that emanated from a nearby statue. As a music student, I had to complete more dictation exercises than you can imagine. So in this instance, this is something that music majors have to do. They have to listen to a melody or a chord progression or a combination of both, and they actually have to write it out on sheet music on a staff system. That's something that's a little more advanced, but anybody that wants to become a musician should learn how to dictate what they hear in the real world. One time at band camp, I watched this horror movie where the instructor made students dictate 4 hours worth of music. If you've ever had to dictate music, you would understand why that is one of the worst horror movies possible. The ability to dictate music requires a student to be able to accurately identify the pitches in real time. Techniques exist for students who want to improve their ability to dictate music. Mostly, dictation requires lots of practice and a willingness to listen to intervals and learn how to identify them. So if you are dictating a performance, the ideal situation is that you'd have a recording of it that you could keep scrubbing back and forth so you can hear particular moments over and over again. And this is actually one way to get really good at dictation, is to listen to a live performance, record it, and then spend the time figuring out what notes were actually played. If you're going to do that, start with some classical period pieces by Mozart, because those pieces are actually a lot easier to dictate than some more complex pieces, like maybe Beethoven or Mahler. Next concept is transcribe, which at first glance may seem like dictation or a form of notation, but it's not. When you transcribe something, it's a process of rewriting a musical work for different instruments. So with dictation, you're taking a performance and you are dictating it so that you can create written notation of the work. With transcribing, you're taking potentially a dictation or a piece that's already been written out for you, the music notation, and you are changing the instruments that are used. So maybe you have a piece that's written for clarinet, Well, you play the flute, so you transcribe it to work for a solo flute. Or maybe you have a tuba quartet and you want to play a piece that was originally written for string quartet. So you take the piece and you write it out for the tuba quartet. You change the instrument so that it can be playable on other instruments. Here are a few examples of that. I need to transcribe this orchestra piece for a wind symphony. A wind symphony is a collection of instruments that use the wind only to perform. An orchestra is an ensemble that uses the violin, viola, some wind instruments like trumpet and trombone, but the majority of the players in an orchestra are going to play stringed instruments. I play the violin, but this piece is written for oboe. Can you transcribe it for the oboe? So in this case, the person is asking if you can take a violin piece, which may have certain idiomatic writing that is only playable on the violin, and create a version of it that would work for the oboe. That's a good example of transcription. This piece is written for a string ensemble, so we need to transcribe it if we want to use it for our piano duo. Another example of taking a piece written for a string ensemble and writing it out for a piano ensemble. Can you transcribe these blockish medieval notes to modern notation? Now that's actually a concept known as neumes. Medieval notes were actually called neumes. They were these blockish note heads. Now in modern notation we use circular, almost oval note heads. And that would be a good example of transcription, because you're taking music that's written in one language and translating it to a more modern system of notation that's more easily readable. So transcription is another one of those difficult words that people often confuse with other words like dictation or notation, or even transposition, which is another word entirely. Transcribing a work involves making the work suitable for a collection of instruments other than the original. This may involve taking a piece written in a different system of notation and rewriting it to work with a modern orchestra. So something that you should understand, there is a word called transposition. This is not something you're going to be tested on, but it might come up in the course. And transposition is simply when you take a piece that's written at one pitch level and you make it higher or lower. That's the simple explanation of transposition. And hence the note on the bottom, the term transcription should not be confused with transposition. Last concept. In Western music, the most commonly used scales are the major and three forms of the minor scale. Scales are a collection of pitches that are arranged in a consecutive order from the lowest to the highest sounding pitch. Major and minor scales contain 7 unique notes. So this term scales is actually a very broad term. However, in this class, we are going to confine its use to the major scales and the 3 forms of the minor scales, which are harmonic, melodic, and natural. You'll learn more about that in Unit 4, but for now just know that I'm going to talk about scales quite a bit, and you should have a basic idea of what a scale is. It's just when you take all the notes in a particular scale and you arrange them from the lowest to the highest pitch. There's going to be 7 notes in a scale. 8 if you want to count the bottom and the top note. This actually repeated. But don't worry about this too much. You just need to understand the concept of a scale is a series of pitches from a lowest to the highest note. I practice my musical scales daily because it helps me develop the coordination in my fingers. That's one of the main reasons that musicians do practice scales, because it creates technique. It makes it easier for them to play music they've never seen before. Especially in the classical and even the romantic periods, a lot of the music will simply use scales. So if you know how to play a piece in a particular key or that uses a particular scale, then you're better equipped to sight read that piece, which can reduce your rehearsal time, and it just makes you a better musician. So here's a response to that. Yeah, well, I practice my musical scales daily because it helps to develop my ear. After all, my finger dexterity is perfect. Oh, well, I practice every musical scale known to man and invent at least one new scale per day. So there's a little musician competition there for you. Most people know on some level what a musical scale consists of. Scales are used by composers to create original works, which is a little bit interesting because you're creating original works that the world has never seen before, but you're using scales that have existed for centuries in most cases. And then when you get into more advanced theory, you start to learn how these scales can be morphed and modulated and changed and rearranged to create some really interesting effects. While this course will only deal with major and minor scales, there are hundreds of scales that exist around the world. You'll find out how our musical scales were formed and why that is relevant in this course. So that's it. Make sure you understand these basic terms before you even start reading the textbook. If you've already read the introduction, then it might be helpful to go back and read the introduction again. Just make sure you really understand these concepts so that you can keep up and do well in the course.